Aloha and welcome everyone, wherever you are in the world. I'm so grateful that you're here to hear this very special webinar because today is the anniversary, the 57th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination.
You are listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
For those of you that were alive at the time, I was only 5 years old when my father broke down in tears telling me that this great American president had died. I was living in Australia at the time. My father was a European dissident. He had escaped two communist regimes in Albania and Yugoslavia. So he hated communism with a passion and loved Kennedy with even greater passion. So that left a really big impact on me because I had no idea who he was. I mean, at 5 years old, clearly that was something that was beyond me at the time. But nevertheless, fast forward a few decades and I'm now a university professor, and I get involved in the UFO issue, the exopolitics issue. And I am intrigued by some of the information concerning Kennedy and a UFO connection. At the time, I didn't know too much about it. The more I dug, the more interesting clues I came across that showed that there was a connection between Kennedy and UFOs and the assassination. So I dug as a result of my research. In 2009, I did a presentation at the International UFO Crash Retrieval Conference in Nevada, in Vegas, Las Vegas, Nevada. That was organized by Ryan Wood, one of the two principal figures in the creation of the Majestic documents. And so I did a presentation there looking at some of those documents and what they tell us about Kennedy during his presidency. So that was my first kind of like deep dive into the Kennedy saga, and it was very intriguing. But the more research I did, much more information came out that was even more intriguing. And by 2013, I had come across a connection between Kennedy's background and the UFO issue. That was something I was very greatly surprised about because no one really talked about the Kennedy assassination in terms of his background. It was all about looking at his policies during his presidency, the whole magic bullet theory, how it all happened, who were the figures involved, the different agencies and so forth. But no one really talked about Kennedy's background before he became president as having any relevance at all to the assassination. It was all about his presidency, all about the policies he was pursuing during his presidency. That was it. That was what people focused on in terms of Kennedy's assassination, what it was. So by looking at his background, I came up with some really fascinating connections, and so I discussed that in my 2013 book called Kennedy's Last Stand. So that came out in late 2013. In 2014, I was going to give a presentation on on my book Kennedy's Last Stand at Joshua Tree at the Contact in the Desert conference, which is a major conference. A couple of thousand people attended at the time. So I was there in the auditorium. About 400 people assembled in the auditorium. I was actually had gotten a flu or something, so I was really suffering. My throat was croaky and headachy and all of that, but I was ready. The show must go on. And so literally 5 minutes before, the power in the whole complex went out, and it was gone for my entire presentation for about 2 hours. The power was down across the complex. Apparently someone had crashed into a power pole nearby. So all the power's gone. So, no PowerPoint presentation, no microphone, no AC. So, the presentation I was going to give really didn't happen. And my croaky throat at the time just wasn't up to par. It wasn't up to the task for a big auditorium to kind of like just project my voice. So that was really a bust. And so from that time, I didn't touch the Kennedy issue again. Thought, okay, this is maybe something I shouldn't discuss, or it just wasn't the right time. But here we are, 6 years later, and now this feels like the right time. And wow, what a time we live in. I mean, everyone knows about this 2020 election and what's happening with President Trump, and everyone's trying to figure it out. We're all trying to scramble to put the pieces together. What's really going on? But nevertheless, today's the Kennedy anniversary, and so everyone, I think, should ask the question: well, is there a connection between Kennedy and Trump? So that's something I will get to at the end of this presentation. So let's begin at the beginning. So I will now begin with the slide presentation. So here we go. So I am going to be ranging over quite a number of issues here. You can see from the banner, we're going to discuss quite a number of things, and I'm going to begin really at the beginning of Kennedy. Major developments since 2013. That's the book cover for that book that came out in 2013. One of the major developments was President Trump. He actually authorized the release of over 50,000 documents that had been classified since the Kennedy assassination that were just held up. They weren't released. CIA and whatever other agency, FBI, had objections to those documents being released, so the great bulk of them just remained classified, weren't released. Some archivists or some document researchers at the National Archives could maybe dig up one or two of the documents, but nevertheless, most of them were just hidden away at the National Archives until this big release under President Trump in October 2017. So you have a tweet there from President Trump saying, subject to receipt of further information, I will be allowing, as President, the long blocked and classified JFK files to be opened. And underneath that, there's a news story from NBC just talking about how these files had been classified for over 50 years, and Trump had tweeted that he was going to declassify them. But nevertheless, the CIA objected to the files being released. So Trump had to review them. So what was going to be an initial release in late 2017 dragged out into 2018 because of CIA objections. Okay, so that's a little bit of background as to why this presentation is happening. So now let's go back to the beginning. President Kennedy. So what is it about his background that shines a light on the assassination? So his father, very important figure in all of this, prominent Irish-American businessman. He was the first head of the US Securities Commission from 1934 to 1935. And that's where he got to meet someone called James Forrestal, who I'll be talking about soon, who was also another very successful businessman from Irish descent, and they struck up a friendship. Kennedy became ambassador to the United Kingdom from January 1938 to October 1940. That's after the Second World War began. And JFK spent time in London with his father during his ambassadorship, and of course got to meet various people there. So JFK wrote a book, actually. In 1939, he toured Europe and the Middle East because he wanted to get some ideas for his thesis topic at Harvard University. So he critiqued Churchill's idea that Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policies were a mistake. And that was something he did because he wanted to support his father, because his father was a big supporter of Neville Chamberlain and thought that appeasement was the right approach to dealing with Adolf Hitler. Churchill, of course, disagreed and wrote his famous book. So JFK critiqued that in his book, and in his senior thesis at Harvard. But it was nevertheless, it was passed, and it was then a book was prepared and released in 1940 and became a bestseller, no doubt due to the fact that JFK's father was a very successful businessman and had a lot of influence over the publisher. So there's a picture of JFK graduating from Harvard University in June of 1940. Joseph Kennedy, big supporter of Neville Chamberlain's Nazi appeasement and opposed US World War II intervention. And at the time, that was very, very popular. There's a very strong anti-war movement, especially Irish Americans and many others. Charles Lindbergh, he also was a spearhead for this anti-war movement in the United States to keep the US out of World War II. Of course, from 1939 up until December of 1941, so that's two years, America was actually not part of the Second World War. And that was because the US neutrality movement, the anti-war movement, was so popular. And there was a lot of support for Nazi Germany in the United States at the time, especially amongst Irish Americans who kind of hated Britain, the British Empire, British imperialism with a passion. And so they actually very, very supportive of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. So it's probably not a great surprise that Joseph Kennedy, after he left the ambassadorship for England, actually actively supported Nazi Germany and supported the Nazi Party by making some major campaign contributions. So you actually have here a comment by J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, from May 3rd, 1941, where he discusses information received at the FBI. Hoover said, quote, "Information has been received at this bureau from a source that is socially prominent and known to be in touch with some of the people involved, but for whom we cannot vouch, to the effect that Joseph P. Kennedy, the former ambassador to England, and Ben Smith, the Wall Street operator, sometime in the past had a meeting with Goering, Hermann Goering, the field marshal. He was in charge of the Luftwaffe in Germany, in Vichy, France, and that thereafter Kennedy and Smith had donated a considerable amount of money to the German cause. They are both described as being very anti-British and pro-German. Not an unusual stance by many Irish Americans at the time who are not at all that fond of the British Empire. Admiral Alan Kirk, yes, he was actually a captain. So Captain Kirk served under Ambassador Kennedy in London from 1939 to 1941. And of course, being the US Naval Attaché in London under Kennedy, Captain Kirk actually got to meet with John F. Kennedy. And Captain Kirk went on to become an admiral in the US Navy and became Chief of Naval Intelligence from in Washington, D.C. from March 1941 to 1942. This is a critical period because this is the period of time when John F. Kennedy actually enlisted in the US, attempted to enlist a number of times unsuccessfully in the US Navy because he had chronic back problems. So he was refused a few times to serve. But because of his father's connection, he was able to get Admiral Kirk at the time to approve his admission into Navy intelligence. So I'm going to move over to the other slide. So let's have the camera here. All right, here we go. So Joseph Kennedy corresponds with Admiral Kirk for JFK to join US Navy intelligence. So Joe Kennedy wrote to the Admiral, "I am having Jack see a medical friend of yours in Boston tomorrow for physical examination, and then I hope he'll become associated with you in naval intelligence." Quite clearly asking Admiral Kirk, "Hey, can you get my son into Navy intelligence?" And Admiral Kirk replied, "Naval intelligence was pleased to accept this exceptionally bright student who has unusual qualities and a definite future in whatever he undertakes." So there you have it. So that's how John F. Kennedy got into the Office of Naval Intelligence. And he served in the Office of Naval Intelligence as an ensign from October 1941 to July of 1942. So a very eventful eight-month period, because that's when the United States entered the Second World War in December of 1941. And he was promoted to lieutenant in October, and then wanted combat, wanted to see combat, and that's what he got to do as a PT boat commander. So there was a little bit of a scandal as to why he had to leave Navy intelligence. He had an affair with a prominent, I think she was a Norwegian socialite suspected of being a Nazi sympathizer. So Navy intelligence said, oh, it might be a good idea if you seek service in another branch of the Navy, combat or something. Maybe that's the best for everyone. So that's what happened later on. So this Pearl Harbor event in December 7, 1941 ended the US anti-war movement overnight. Clearly the United States had been attacked. Now all of a sudden America is on a war footing. What was very strong support for the anti-war effort translated into strong patriotism, and millions of people enlisted and or sought to serve the US Army in whatever way. Now, that happened in December. 2 months later, there was this incident, the Los Angeles UFO air raid on February 25, where you have a number of very large objects, or one very large object and a number of smaller objects flying around it, drifting slowly over Los Angeles on the night of February 25. And this is something that is not kind of well understood in history in terms of being very significant. Even for the UFO aficionados, they don't really appreciate the full significance of this event. But nevertheless, something really major happened here. There were over 1,400 artillery shells fired by the Army, and the Navy also unloaded its battleships in the harbour there, I think it's Long Beach harbour there. So it was a pretty major incident. Lots of artillery being shot at the UFOs that just hovered there and didn't kind of fly away quickly, just withered that bombardment. So it was major news at the time. Now, as far as the official story is concerned, it was just a case of mistaken identity. Artillerymen from the Army got a case of war jitters. That's the official explanation, both from the Army Chief of Staff and from the Navy Chief of Staff. But we know from a number of leaked documents, Majestic documents, that actually something else happened that was very, very significant for us in investigating this secret background to JFK and its link to UFOs. So the Majestic documents, they are a large number of leaked documents that are, many of them are official documents that were leaked, which means that though they are official documents, because they were leaked and not officially declassified, it means that whatever agency or military department that created that document doesn't authorize it, doesn't recognize it as valid. So these documents are contested. But nevertheless, these documents have been rigorously examined and authenticated by Dr. Robert Wood and his son Ryan, other leading UFO researchers such as Stanton Friedman. And these provide invaluable information about key personnel, historical events, and processes involving UFOs and extraterrestrial life. And for anyone wanting to understand the UFO connection with Kennedy and the assassination, these documents are truly invaluable. They really, you can't do it. Without these documents filled in so many missing pieces of the puzzle as to Kennedy's background and what it is that led to his assassination, that without them I couldn't have done this research, written the book, or even put together this presentation. So I want to thank Dr. Wood and his son and the other researchers for their efforts, and I believe Dr. Wood is actually even with us listening into this. So I want to personally thank you, Bob, for everything you've done to make these majestic documents available. So here we have one of the documents that really is very critical for understanding what happened during the Los Angeles air raid. This was a document, a memorandum from the Chief of the Army, the Chief of the War Department as it was known at the time, George Marshall, to President Roosevelt. And it said, quote, regarding the air raid over Los Angeles, it was learned by Army G2 that Rear Admiral Anderson, Naval Intelligence, recovered an unidentified airplane off the coast of California with no bearing on conventional explanation. This headquarters has come to the determination that the mystery airplanes are in fact not earthly, and according to secret intelligence sources, they are in all probability of interplanetary origin. So, very important document. It is one of several that actually point out that the Los Angeles air raid incident involved extraterrestrial spacecraft, and that at least 2 of these were actually captured, that they were downed in some way, or gifted according to some sources. Now, the connection to Navy intelligence is very important because the Majestic document points out that the Rear Admiral from Navy intelligence had possession of one of the retrieved flying saucer craft of extraterrestrial origin. So clearly back in 1942, you can imagine the Office of Naval Intelligence, it would have been a lot of excitement. The secrecy was very different then. It was more kind of like an in-house secret. So it's not surprising that many decades later, people or researchers like Linda Moulton Howe got told from her sources that that Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, had knowledge of extraterrestrial life that was based on some first-hand knowledge from his service as a US Navy intelligence officer. So going back to 1942, when up until October of 1942, John F. Kennedy was actually part of the Office of Naval Intelligence, he learned about the crashed UFOs that had been retrieved from the Los Angeles incident. He was part of the Navy intelligence. We know from the Majestic documents that some of these craft had been retrieved and that Navy intelligence had them. And also from Linda Moulton Howe's sources, we're told that Kennedy had knowledge of the extraterrestrial issue dating back to the time when he was in Navy intelligence. Very important piece of the puzzle and of Kennedy's background to keep in mind here. So let's move on. After World War II now, JFK travels to Germany with the Secretary of the Navy. Now, the Secretary of the Navy was James Forrestal, and he was an old buddy of Joseph Kennedy. They were both on the Security Exchange Commission that Kennedy was the first director of, Joseph Kennedy. And so they were old friends, and so Forrestal knew about John F. Kennedy. And Forrestal was very impressed by Kennedy, very precocious, and Forrestal thought that Kennedy would be a fine addition to his staff. So now, what do we know about JFK's trip to Germany? Now, we know that Forrestal did lead a small delegation of people to Germany immediately after the Second World War. And there's a picture there of Forrestal with his Navy subordinates while he was Navy Secretary. You have this figure there. There you go. The book, that's the cover of a little known book, Prelude to Leadership. This is a book that was posthumously published. It's based on the post-war diary of John F. Kennedy. And it gives all the details about his trip to Germany after the Second World War. So here's a document I got from Princeton University. I actually went to the Forrestal Library there at Princeton and dug around looking for any documents for my 2013 book, Kennedy's Last Stand, and I found this very interesting document. And the substance of the document, you might not be able to read it, but maybe it can be magnified. But what the document essentially said is that Forrestal wanted to recruit JFK to his personal staff and invited him to be part of a post-war trip to occupy Germany. So thank you for magnifying that. So the Dear Joe, my plans about getting overseas with are a little indefinite. I expect to go with the Admiral and the Bureau of Ships sometime soon at the end of the month. When a definite date is determined, I will tell you. Sorry, I have difficulty reading that myself. So, but the substance of that letter is that Forrestal was inviting John F. Kennedy to join him on the trip to Germany, and that he wanted John Kennedy to join his personal staff. So he wanted to recruit Kennedy to his personal staff. So there you have some pictures with JFK and Forrestal in post-war Germany. So you see at the right there, that's JFK right there. He's just walking behind Forrestal and a number of Navy officers in post-war Germany. JFK again with Forrestal in post-war Germany. That's an official photo. Second from the right in Berlin in 1945. So JFK was part of this US military effort to find out what the Germans had technologically. So here's another photo with JFK highlighted. You see the JFK there walking in the background. That's Forrestal meeting with General Eisenhower, the victorious general, five-star general in charge of all of the Allied armies in Europe. So Forrestal got to meet him, and presumably Kennedy at some point at least got to shake hands or say hello. But very significant. Kennedy was there in post-war Germany. Now, as part of this mission with Forrestal, Kennedy was taken to see the advanced technologies that Nazi Germany had that were of interest to the Navy. And so in his book Prelude to Leadership, Kennedy wrote, "The harbour of Bremerhaven was full of captured ships. Figures were given which showed German submarine production at about one a day. These submarines were all equipped with the Schussel breathing device, which enabled them to stay underwater for long periods. One submarine on a 30-day cruise only surfaced 4 hours." So for those days, that was phenomenal. So Kennedy was with Forrestal as they were reviewing all of these advanced captured German technologies that were of interest to the Navy, especially the submarines, which became a big part of the priorities that the Navy set for itself in the latter part of the 40s and the 50s. So he learned about a lot of Nazi submarines. So did Kennedy learn about Nazi submarine convoys to Antarctica? Quite possible. It's a question. Don't have the answer to that. Did Forrestal know about it? I think he probably did. Forrestal had a lot of information, and I'm sure he shared a lot of that because he was friends with Kennedy's father. He trusted the young Kennedy and wanted to, and actually took him to Germany because he had plans to have him join his staff. So I'm sure Kennedy was very excited by the prospect of becoming a part of the staff of the Secretary of the US Navy, very prominent position. Kennedy attended the Potsdam Conference as Secretary Forrestal's guest and witnessed high-level discussions on dividing up Germany's territories and technological assets. So Kennedy was there during this multinational effort to divvy up everything that Nazi Germany was working on at the time. Britain, United States, and the Soviet Union divvied up all of the Nazi assets. Here's a quote from a Major General Hugh Nur talking about the superiority of German technology. Quote, "Occupation of German scientific and industrial establishments has revealed the fact that we have been alarmingly backward in many fields of research. If we do not take the opportunity to seize the apparatus and the brains that developed it and put the combination back to work promptly, we will remain several years behind while we attempt to cover a field already exploited. So there was a priority there on capturing any German technologies that were ahead of what the Allies had developed in their own laboratories and military institutions. Part of James Forrestal's mission in post-war Germany was to observe captured Nazi technologies of interest to the Navy and to repatriate these under Operation Paperclip. What captured technologies would be of most interest to the Navy? Of course, submarines, fighter jets, and what else? Nazi flying saucers. We know the Nazis were working on flying saucers. That's been something that's been shown to be true by numerous documents, by many people that have come forward to talk about their involvement in a Nazi flying saucer program. The debate is over whether or not those flying saucers were ever successfully developed and actually put into operation or flown elsewhere down to South America or down to Antarctica. That's where the big debate is amongst UFO researchers. But as far as historical evidence is concerned, it's quite clear that the Nazis were working on a number of flying saucer prototypes. And we know from various whistleblowers, various insiders, that the Nazis were working on up to 30 different types of flying saucer craft with varying propulsion systems, varying navigation systems, varying armaments on them. And the successful ones were relocated after the war, South America, Antarctica. The unsuccessful prototypes were left behind in Germany, and that's what the Americans and the Russians and the British found and kind of divvied them up amongst themselves to kind of get ahead of the others on this new race to develop these flying saucer craft that were capable of supersonic flight, which at the time was something incredible. The first jet fighters just began to appear at the end of the Second World War by Nazi Germany, but they weren't supersonic craft. But they still could fly much faster than the rotary craft of the US Air Force at the time. So what happened to Kennedy? Well, I'm going to shift over to the other camera here. And so Kennedy decided, no doubt under great pressure from his father, that he wouldn't join Forrestal's staff at all, and that instead he would embark on a political career. So with his father's money and contacts, and Kennedy being a war hero, Kennedy was elected to the US Congress in November of 1946, and representing a district in Massachusetts, in Boston. So Kennedy becomes a congressman, and he begins serving in January, I think it would have been like January 3rd of 1947. Kennedy begins his first term in the US Congress. Now, January 1947, 6 months later, something really significant happened. The flying saucer incident at Roswell. Now, of course, everyone knows about the Roswell incident, so I'm not going to talk at any length about it. It happened over the July 4th weekend at a ranch near the town of Roswell, New Mexico. The Army Air Force at the time first releases a press release saying we've captured a flying saucer, and then later in the day it was retracted by more senior officials. But of course, later on, decades later, we hear that retraction was just BS, that really was a flying saucer that was captured. Now, we know from the leaked Majestic documents that an investigation unit was sent to that flying saucer crash, and they confirmed that it was an extraterrestrial craft. Now, what's interesting about one of these documents, one of these Majestic documents, the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit report, is that it actually refers to JFK being briefed about the Roswell UFO. I mean, fancy that. I mean, he was briefed. I mean, who knew that? Those, of course, who have read the Majestic documents know about it, but publicly, I mean, no one would have guessed that John F. Kennedy would have known about the Roswell crash back then. The Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, I mean, that was confirmed later on to be a real Army unit that was created in this era, and that it was later moved over to the Air Force, who then promptly abolished it, or really what they did was they renamed it. They renamed the whole thing. So in the document, the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit report, this is what it had to say about JF Kennedy. It has become known to the Counterintelligence Corps that some of the recovery operation was shared with Representative John F. Kennedy, Massachusetts Democrat, elected to Congress in 1946. Kennedy had limited duty as naval officer assigned to naval intelligence during war. It is believed that information was obtained from a source in Congress, who is close to Secretary for Air Force. Well, at the time, James Forrestal was the Secretary of the Navy, so he could well have been the one that briefed Kennedy about it, or he shared it with another source that then shared it with Kennedy indirectly. But nevertheless, Kennedy was briefed on the Roswell issue, and he knew about it, which kind of makes sense that if he knew about flying saucers from his time as Navy intelligence back in 1942. He goes to Germany in 1947. He sees some of the captured Nazi craft, learns about the Nazis relocating some of these to Antarctica, a possible extraterrestrial element to what the Nazis were doing, that Kennedy would have known about this. So it's not surprising that he would have been briefed as someone that was knowledgeable on these issues, especially being a congressman. Not many congressmen at the time would have had any idea of any of this, but Kennedy was one of the fortunate few that would have had some experience. Now, the next big development in Kennedy's life was that his mentor, James Forrestal, becomes the new Secretary of Defense, the first Secretary of Defense. He gets appointed in July 27, 1947, and you have the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, being officially launched in, September 18, 1947. So then you have the Department of the Air Force is launched for the first time, the Department of the Army, and the Department of the Navy. They were the three big departments. So Forrestal occupies this very important position, and he is also responsible for overseeing how America responds to the UFO issue. So Forrestal sets up the Majestic-12 Group. I mean, that is really important here. We need to appreciate that James Forrestal, the mentor of John F. Kennedy, who had accompanied Kennedy or had gotten Kennedy to go with him to post-war Germany to recruit him, that he was the one that played the instrumental role in setting up the Majestic-12 Group. So here you have a Majestic document signed by Harry Truman, President Truman, for the official creation of the Majestic-12 Group. And it said, in the document it says, as per our recent conversation on this matter, you are hereby authorized to proceed with all due speed and caution upon your undertaking. Hereafter, this matter shall be referred to only as Operation Majestic-12. It continues to be my feeling that any future considerations relative to the ultimate disposition of this matter should rest solely with the Office of the President, following appropriate discussion with yourself, Dr. Bush, and Director of Central Intelligence. Okay, so there you have it. Forrestal is the person who was playing this instrumental role as Secretary of Defense in setting up Operation Majestic-12. So Forrestal, not surprisingly, was a founding member of the Majestic-12 Group that was created to manage all extraterrestrial related projects and also deal with the German presence in Antarctica, or whatever the Germans had relocated to Antarctica in South America. Majestic-12 Group was looking after all of this. So he, on your that document there, that document is one of the it's not, I think it might even be the cover page of the Eisenhower briefing document, but certainly one of the first pages in that, and it gives you a rundown of the first group of Majestic-12 officials. And the third member on that list, you have Admiral Hillenkotter, Director of the CIA, Dr. Vannevar Bush, President Truman's science advisor, and then you have James Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense. So these were the founding members of the Majestic-12 Group. So this was the group that was set up to come up with a coherent policy for the US national security apparatus in dealing with the whole UFO ET phenomenon. Now, Forrestal challenges Truman and MJ-12 over the secrecy policy. He opposes the emerging New World Order. Yep, back then there was a New World Order that was being envisaged that was based on secrecy and elite management of the UFO and ET system. Truman was opposed to that. Forrestal was opposed to that. Truman was in favor of that. Forrestal wanted the truth to come out. And there were many people in the US military at the time that shared that desire to have all of this information come out and let it all come out and see where the chips fall, and America would deal with it, because if America was victorious in the Second World War, Americans could handle a task like this. But unfortunately, Forrestal was in a small minority of one. The other members of the Majestic-12 Group disagreed with him, and most importantly, Truman also disagreed with him. So they wanted the UFO issue to remain a secret. So Forrestal tried to do an end run around that and began to meet with US congressmen and to inform them about the Majestic-12 Group, to give these kind of like unauthorized briefings to congressmen. As the Secretary of Defense, he took it upon himself to do that. And that led to a lot of problems. So he starts getting followed, there's wiretapping, strange foreign agents begin harassing him, and as a consequence of him losing the policy battle over the direction and scope of the Majestic-12 Group, he's forced to resign in March of 1949, and he's then shortly afterwards committed to the Bethesda Naval Medical Center. So while he's there at the Bethesda Medical Center, supposedly recuperating from the mental breakdown, in fact, he was being harassed and pressured by different people associated with Majestic-12 to not continue his dangerous policy of spilling or revealing or briefing congressmen about what's been going on. So here you have Truman, here you have Forrestal, former Secretary of Defense, laid up in Bethesda Naval Hospital, and he's visited by people. Admiral Sidney Sawyers, one of the principal figures he was Truman's advisor and also a member of the Majestic-12 Group, President Truman himself, Lewis Johnson, who was Forrestal's replacement as Secretary of Defense, and interestingly enough, pay attention here, Lyndon Johnson, who at the time had just won his election to join the US Senate. He had been previously a 3-time congressman in the House of Representatives for Texas. This was in 1946 he ran for the Senate. In 1948 he ran for the Senate and won, but only after a lot of controversy, after a rigged poll. I mean, even back then polls were being rigged. Johnson found, after Johnson had lost the Senate election, a mysterious box with over 100 votes for Johnson suddenly was found, and miraculously tipped the scales in favor of Johnson, so he became a US Senator. So who did Johnson owe a big favour to for that victorious election. Now, so this was one of the other people that visited Forrestal in the Bethesda Medical Center Hospital before Forrestal is found dead after a fall from his 16th floor office suite. And this was only hours before Forrestal was to be released. So very suspicious timing, and many people, myself included, believe that there's sufficient evidence that Forrestal was actually killed, suicided, for briefing members of Congress about the MJ-12 operations. That's really what got Forrestal killed, that he was breaking the secrecy surrounding MJ-12, and he was suicided. Now, it was big news at the time. There was because Forrestal was revered in the United States. He was the Secretary of the Navy, first Secretary of of Defense. He was a revered figure. So even though he had supposedly suicided himself, there was a big commemoration and funeral and so forth for him in Washington, D.C. Now, this deeply affected John F. Kennedy, who was serving his second term in Congress at the time. And Kennedy was devastated by this because Forrestal was his mentor, apart from Kennedy's father, Joseph, who was the first person to kind of introduce him to a senior level of political life. It was Forrestal who took him into that top tier of political life in the US, through that trip to Germany, and meeting all of these very senior officials. So Forrestal was a very influential figure in Kennedy's life, and you get a sense of that from this photo of JFK mourning Forrestal in May 28, 1963. This was 1 week before JFK was to travel to White Sands Missile Base to meet with the German scientists that were taken there under Operation Paperclip, and very significant in what I will be discussing later as far as his efforts to get to the bottom of the UFO issue. But there you have it, Kennedy visiting the grave of his former mentor in May 28. And I think, what was Kennedy thinking at the time? My thought is that just before JFK is about to embark on an important trip to meet with German scientists to kind of get to the bottom of the UFO issue, he visits this gravesite, and I think maybe he was kind of saying a prayer, a silent prayer to Forrestal, saying, my old friend, where you failed, I'm going to succeed. I'm going to bring the truth out. Something to that effect. And that's precisely what I'm going to be presenting a little bit later. So Forrestal dies in 1949. Eisenhower is elected in 1952, but slightly after this incident, there was a flyover of Washington, D.C. Now, many people, myself included, believed at the time, when I first learned about this, I thought, well, this was very likely extraterrestrial craft. But since that time, I've gotten new information that these weren't extraterrestrial craft at all, that these were German spacecraft flying out of Antarctica or out of South America, and they were flying over Washington, D.C. in a demonstration of power, saying, look, your best technologies, your best anti-aircraft technologies don't have a chance against us. We want to make a deal with you. So let's make a deal. And that's, I think, exactly what happened. This was a flyover to demonstrate the superiority of the German flying saucer fleets flying out of Antarctica. And there was an agreement that was reached about this. So, there's some evidence that Eisenhower did fly secretly fly off to different military bases to conduct negotiations with different groups of extraterrestrials. And also this second one at Holloman Air Force Base in 1955, that Eisenhower got to meet with a delegation, and that these were actually Germans, that these weren't extraterrestrials, or maybe extraterrestrials may have been involved in some support role, but that Eisenhower got to meet with Germans in 1955 at Holloman Air Force Base, which adjoins White Sands Missile Range, which is where a lot of the German paperclip scientists were taken after the war. So an agreement was reached, and this agreement is a very significant one, because this would enable the US to get access to some of the technological secrets that the Germans understood, and the US hoped to gain German assistance in understanding some of the retrieved flying saucer craft that they had gotten from Roswell, other places in New Mexico, and other crash retrieval operations around the world. You know, the short, I mean, the summary of it is that what the Americans lacked was detailed technical knowledge on how to reverse engineer some of these captured flying saucer craft. The Germans had an abundance of knowledge on how to reverse engineer these craft, but what they lacked was resources and manpower to develop their space program out of Antarctica. So an agreement was reached where everyone, the Americans and the Germans, were able to share their resources for a common cause. And who was the principal figure in reaching that agreement? Alan Dulles was the director of Central Intelligence. He was Eisenhower's Fourth Reich negotiator. And that's not a big surprise for anyone that knows about the history of Alan Dulles during the Second World War. Dulles was based in Geneva, Switzerland, and he was with the Office of Strategic Services. And part of his job was actually to negotiate with Nazis to get them to surrender. And he's negotiated some really high-profile surrenders. So he was an expert negotiator, had good contacts with the Nazis, and so with the Nazis surviving in Antarctica, Dulles was the natural person to negotiate with them, and that's what he did. So a deal was struck between the Majestic-12 Group and the Germans in Antarctica, and Eisenhower later on felt that the Majestic-12 Group had betrayed him, that whatever benefits the US had gotten from this agreement, whatever benefits the US was getting from these reverse engineering programs that were being conducted at classified facilities such as Area 51 or the S4 facility, that he wasn't being briefed about it. And this is something that we've had two credible sources come forward and talk about it. One was a whistleblower that used the name Cooper, that Linda Moulton Howe investigated, and she thought he was credible. Lots of documentation, but he wanted to remain anonymous for his safety and the safety of his family. So his documents have never been publicly released, but Linda Moulton Howe vetted him and said that he's a credible insider. He was an army cryptologist. So he says that President Eisenhower got so frustrated with the Majestic-12 Group and its secrecy over exactly what was being developed, that he threatened to invade Area 51 with the US 1st Army based out of Colorado. So this is what he said. Quote, "We called the people in from MJ-12, from Area 51 and S4, but they told us that the government had no jurisdiction over what they were doing. I want you and your boss to fly out there. I want you to give them a personal message. I want you to tell them, whoever is in charge, I want you to tell them that they have this coming week to get into Washington and to report to me. And if they don't, I'm going to get the 1st Army from Colorado. We're going to go over and take the base over. I don't care what kind of classified material you got. We are going to rip this thing apart. So that's what this whistleblower revealed from Eisenhower's ultimatum to MJ-12 back around 1958. Very important. And what is also something to keep in mind is that Richard Nixon was a part of it. He was someone that was part of this ultimatum that Eisenhower issued to MJ-12. He saw what happened. He saw MJ-12 back down. And so MJ-12, when Eisenhower left office, MJ-12 did not want Nixon to win the election. They were opposed to Nixon. And Dulles used, and the CIA used whatever resources they had at the time to fix the 1960 election, which saw JFK defeat Nixon by a small margin. And two of the two battlegrounds, or two states at the time where this made a difference, was Illinois and Texas, where JFK was able to win those states, very close margins, and apparently he won it with some election rigging, old-fashioned election rigging. And this is interesting because it suggests that a deal was struck for Kennedy to win the election. Now, many people who have researched the Kennedy assassination will say that, yes, Joe Kennedy made a deal with the mafia to steal enough votes in Chicago to win the election in Illinois, which was enough for him to become president. But the other question we have to ask is, well, was it just the mafia? Did Joe Kennedy also reach a deal with the Fourth Reich, MJ-12? Because we know Joe Kennedy had good connections with Nazis. He was a former Nazi supporter, as I've mentioned, and he was someone that got on very well with Allen Dulles. So through Dulles, there's a possibility that Joseph Kennedy could have reached a deal for his son to be elected president. And MJ-12, Fourth Reich, CIA collaborated in making sure Nixon didn't win the election. Nixon was the enemy, so they didn't want him to get elected. So, was Nixon robbed? Well, there's a good quote here from an article by David Greenberg, I think sums it up quite well. "You gotta swallow this one," says a Republican hack in Oliver Stone's Nixon, referring to the 1960 election in which John F. Kennedy prevailed. They stole it fair and square. So there you have it. It's like election rigging at the time was understood to be pervasive, and if you could get away with it, well, good luck to you. The other side would concede, you'd be elected to that office, and that's it, end of story. That was tradition. If you could get away with the election rigging, that's it. That was the end of the story. So Nixon apparently was robbed. So now Kennedy is president-elect. So just before Kennedy becomes president, January 17, 3 days before President-elect Kennedy becomes President Kennedy, Eisenhower dropped a bomb, goes on national television and said this: "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes." So what was Eisenhower referring to? Many people think that he was talking about the military-industrial complex. Some expand that to say he was really talking about the military-industrial congressional complex, which is created by Congress being lobbied by all of these armaments industry, all of these major corporations to buy bigger and better bombs and tanks and airplanes and so forth, and to perpetuate this kind of like war footing that the United States is in. Such people kind of like associate his warning just with that. But I think given what I've already mentioned, Eisenhower feeling betrayed by the Majestic-12 Group, his threat to invade Area 51, I think his warning really had someone else in mind, or at least there was another aspect to the military-industrial complex which the general public just wasn't aware of at the time. So how do we know that this was the truth? Well, one other source who came forward, he reached the rank of a colonel in the Army JAG officer corps, and he was working for signals intelligence for the US Army back in the Eisenhower administration. So he actually worked alongside President Eisenhower. So he's an eyewitness. General Lovkin, he was an eyewitness, and he says, he quoted about it, he discussed Kennedy's speech, and he said, he discussed Eisenhower's farewell address. And Lovkin says, that's Eisenhower, said the main thing we have to fear is the military-industrial complex, he wasn't kidding. And he had the UFO subject matter we are talking about in mind. He was quite explicit about that. So Lovkin is telling us that Eisenhower was very upset over MJ-12 or those managing the UFO issue. So Eisenhower warns Kennedy. Not surprisingly, he warns him about this rogue group. And he tells Kennedy, look, you've got to be careful of this UFO issue. And I think Eisenhower knew that Kennedy was knowledgeable about the UFO issue because they were both briefed about the Roswell incident, and Eisenhower probably knew that Kennedy was aware of the Los Angeles air raid incident. So I think Eisenhower would have felt comfortable giving Kennedy a detailed briefing on what he knew about the Majestic-12 Group and the danger that MJ-12 posed to the presidency, and to watch your back. These guys can't be trusted. I think something to that effect that he warned Kennedy. And so Kennedy was someone that was warned by Eisenhower about the Majestic-12 Group, that this was a rogue group, essentially, and that they were conducting all of these operations concerning UFOs, extraterrestrial life, without briefing the presidency. They had taken it out of the hands of the executive branch, that is the office of the president, and dealing with it all behind the scenes in a interagency group called Majestic-12, making all the key decisions without the president being briefed. So for Eisenhower, this was intolerable, but the Majestic-12 Group had to accommodate him. For Kennedy, I think Eisenhower understood that the Majestic-12 Group was very likely not going to give Kennedy any briefings at all. So he gave Kennedy the warning. So there are three phases in Kennedy's struggle with the Majestic-12 Group over the UFO files. And those are the members of the Majestic-12 Group, as best as I could guess, based on the data available. And in my book, Kennedy's Last Stand, there's a whole chapter there going into each one of these people and why they would have been the logical person to have occupied that position in the Majestic-12 Group. The most important for our purposes today is MJ1, Alan Dulles. So Dulles, at some point, became the director of the Majestic-12 Group. Probably not that great a surprise, given that he was the director of Central Intelligence from the beginning of Eisenhower's administration up until November of 1961. And prior to that, Dulles ran the covert operations division within the CIA. So he was the one that was probably the most knowledgeable amongst the Majestic-12 groups as to exactly what was going on. And so he was best placed to either brief Kennedy or not brief Kennedy. He was the one that was going to make that call. So there's 3 phases in Kennedy's struggle, and I'm going to go over each of those. The first phase is he tried to get access to classified UFO files hidden in psychological warfare operations. I will explain that shortly. The second phase, he began visiting military bases to learn about UFOs and extraterrestrials. And the third phase is going to be space cooperation with the USSR. So that'll be something I'll get into when we come back from the break. But I hope to, in the next hour, cover these first 2 phases with you. So let's move over here to this side. Okay, so here we are. I will appear shortly, magically. There I am. Okay, so phase 1, the struggle for control over psychological operations and classified UFO files. So there's a photo of Kennedy with Dulles during the 1960 election campaign. So why the relationship between psychological operations and classified UFO files? Okay, UFOs and psychological operations. As a former Navy intelligence officer, briefings from Forrestal, 14 years in the US Congress, knowledge of UFOs and Eisenhower's warning, Kennedy knew that UFO information was closely related to intelligence, covert operations, and psychological warfare, and a classified project called Majestic-12. So these are the things that Kennedy knew from his history, from his background. So early in his administration, in February 1961, Kennedy issues an executive order abolishing the Operations Coordinating Board and placing all psychological operations under the control of his National Security Advisor. So Kennedy knew that psychological operations was where all of this stuff was being hidden concerning UFOs, reverse engineering, extraterrestrial craft, and construction of future construction of a secret space program. All of that was being done under psychological operations. And we know that Majestic-12 had a lot to do with psychological operations. There are 3 1952 top secret memorandums from the Joint Chiefs of Staff titled Joint Logistic Plan for Majestic. These were classified in 1976. So these are official documents. These are not contested. These are not leaked. These are officially declassified documents talking about a joint logistic plan for Majestic that was declassified in 1976. So there was a Majestic program that dates back from at least 1952 that involved some logistical planning. So the Operation Majestic and psychological warfare. So this Majestic plan that was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in September 1952 is this memorandum that was declassified covers the different areas that Operation Majestic are going to be dealing with. So point 3 there, it says A, psychological warfare plan, an unconventional warfare plan, cover and deception plans, a civil affairs and military government plan, a command plan, a logistic plan, and so forth. So you get the idea that this was something that was a very big operation. Operation Majestic was a very big operation requiring psychological warfare, unconventional warfare, cover and deception programs. So it was a big deal. This was not a small affair at all. Whatever Operation Majestic was, it involved a lot of logistical support, psychological warfare, planning, and so forth. So Operation Majestic and psychological warfare, the 1952 memos are consistent with a leaked document called the Special Operations Manual 101, which deals with extraterrestrial entities and technology recovery and disposal. So this was this is something you can find in the Majestic documents. I think you can actually buy the booklet as well. So it's a great booklet. I got one. Certainly something buy a few copies and give them away to friends as Christmas gifts or something. A really good way to kind of like spread information about a program or a document dealing with extraterrestrial technologies and recoveries. And it shows that a 1952 Majestic program was underway that involved support in a number of areas associated with UFO crash retrieval operations. Psychological warfare, covert military operations, civil affairs, military government logistics, communications, and all of these. These are all discussed in the Special Operations Manual, that document. These are all discussed in that. And this is a very big clue into what it was that Majestic-12 used to cover its operations. It was psychological warfare, and Kennedy knew that. And so that's why he abolished the Operations Coordinating Board in 1961 in February and brought it under the control of his National Security Advisor, because he wanted to get control. Probably what Eisenhower probably told him, like, this Operations Coordinating Board, it's a real pain in the butt. You've got to get a firm control on that, and so he was probably following Eisenhower's advice. So what happens in April of 1961? There's this botched operation that breaks JFK and Dulles' relationship. Presumably up until the Bay of Pigs, Dulles and Kennedy had a good relationship because Dulles probably worked very closely with Joe Kennedy to get Kennedy elected. I think that was probably part of the deal. So I think they had a positive relationship, and of course Dulles was a carryover from the Eisenhower administration, which itself was surprising, because the tradition is that when you start a new administration, you put your own people in control of different government entities and departments, but Kennedy kept Dulles on, so maybe that was part of the deal that was reached. But what broke the deal, or what certainly soured the relationship greatly, was the Bay of Pigs, which of course was a botched operation that embarrassed Kennedy greatly. And I think I don't need to talk too much about what happened during the Bay of Pigs. It was just a failed covert operation where CIA support for Cuban exiles retaking Cuba failed because the Cubans were waiting for him. Fidel Castro was waiting for the rebels to land and just took them out very easily. So Kennedy was very upset by the botched operation. He thought it compromised his whole administration, made him look bad, and so he, famous quote, he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds, because he felt that he had been betrayed, he'd been set up, that he felt that this was a botched operation designed to make him look bad or put him into this lose-lose situation. So he took it out on Dulles and forced Dulles' resignation. And so Dulles had to announce his resignation or submit the resignation, and that was Dulles' resignation would take effect in November of 1961, which gave Dulles plenty of time to put in place whatever plans needed to be put there so that he could deal with the Kennedy administration. Shortly after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy does his famous moon landing speech. Quote, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth." So that was May 25, before the joint sitting of the of Congress. It was probably his first address, first State of the Union address. I imagine that's probably what it was in his first term. So he gave that speech and set a moon landing as a priority for his administration before the end of the decade, a major initiative. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is why? You know, this happened shortly after the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy is now breaking from Dulles. He felt that Dulles and the CIA and the Majestic-12 Group couldn't be trusted, so he comes forward with this speech. And I think these were his motivations. 3 motivations. Space race with the Soviet Union. Okay, everyone knows about that. Sputnik goes up in 1957. Yuri Gagarin, first cosmonaut in space, first man in space. America is behind. We need to catch up, and the best way to catch up and get ahead of the Soviets was to be the first to land a man on the moon. So that's well known. Another motivation is that this was a cover, that the Apollo program to send an American to the moon was actually a cover program for a lot of money and resources to be shifted over to the German program in Antarctica under the Eisenhower deal, that this was part of a deal. And if you needed to get a lot of money, and how could you explain where this money was going? Well, you set up a cover program, such as the Apollo program. The real goal is not to develop rocket propulsion that can take people to the moon, but to have a cover so that you can transfer men and resources over to the Antarctic Germans, and in return you can get know-how on how to reverse engineer anti-gravity spacecraft using space-time technologies, far more sophisticated than any rocket propulsion technologies. And finally, gaining access to classified space technologies and UFO technologies that Kennedy probably understood that, okay, MJ-12 was like this dragon covering its hoard of gold and not wanting to share that. Okay, so MJ-12 is this dragon, a black dragon hoarding its gold, the precious secrets. So how do you prize loose those precious secrets? Well, you do a mission to the moon. You actually try to get these secrets out there, because now you've created the infrastructure for space operations, and that's going to require a lot of these technological secrets to be released for the space program to be successful. So now we get one of the leaked Majestic documents that begins to tie us into this link between Kennedy, UFOs, and the assassination. Okay, so this document is dated June 28, 1961. It's a national security memorandum to the director of Central Intelligence, review of MJ-12 intelligence operations as they relate to Cold War psychological warfare operations. I would like a brief summary from you at your earliest convenience. So what Kennedy is doing here is sending a document to Dulles in June saying, hey, before you leave, before you resign, this is what I want you to do. Give me a brief summary of Majestic-12 operations as they relate to psychological warfare. The code here is, tell me all about the UFO issue. Okay, how do we know that? Well, we know that from Dulles's response. But before I get to Dulles's response, let me just kind of cover what this June 28 memo says, what else it has to say. So yeah, he's wanting to learn about MJ-12 activities and wanting to get control of psychological warfare operations. So this was Kennedy's attempt to get access to UFO files. So why do I say that? Why does that document, which doesn't mention UFOs, but just mentions psychological operations as they relate to MJ-12, how does that connect to UFOs? Well, Dulles's response tells us that they do. So this is what Dulles responded in. This is another leaked document. Oops, I think I might have the wrong document there. Oh. Okay, I have the wrong document there. Okay, so unfortunately, that's the wrong document. What should be there is a classified top secret document with MJ-12 codeword access. Oh, No, that's not it. That's not either. Oh, that's the... Going to see... Oh, yeah. Okay. I do get up to Dulles' response a little bit later. So sorry about that. So Dulles responded in October 1961. So I just want to get the chronology right here. So Kennedy drafts his memo in June of 1961 telling Dulles, give me a brief summary of Cold War psychological operations as they relate to Majestic-12. So what does Dulles do? Next thing he does is in September of 1961, that's the approximate date, he drafts a set of 8 directives to respond to Kennedy's inquiries into the UFO issue. So these documents, these 8 directives, are really critical for what is to come in the presentation. That these 8 directives tell us what the thinking was of the Majestic-12 Group as Kennedy is trying to find out about UFOs, assert presidential authority over the UFO issue and over the Majestic-12 Group. So these documents tell us a lot. So the first document, it tells us that this is a top secret document with MJ-12 code word access. So you can see at the top of the document it says top secret MJ-12. So that tells us top secret classification, and MJ-12 is the code word for the compartment that top secret document relates to. So if you wanted to get this document at the time, you needed to have access to, you need to have top secret security clearance, you needed to have access to MJ-12 code word, and you also needed to have need to know. So those 3 things are what determine whether or not you get to see documents. You need to have the security classification, you need to have compartmentalized code word access, and you need to have need to know. So this document is critical because it enumerates 8 directives. And these 8 directives outline how Majestic-12 was going to respond to Kennedy's inquiries into the UFO issue, or inquiries from his administration, or inquiries from the press over UFOs, flying saucers. So this is what it says here, this document. The first paragraph says, quote, as you must know, Lancer, Kennedy's secret service code name, has made some inquiries regarding our activities which we cannot allow. Please submit your views no later than October. Your action to this matter is critical to the continuance of the group. So very important. So the CIA director, that's Dulles, drafted this memo to the Majestic-12 Group saying Kennedy's asking about what we're doing in MJ-12, and I need your response urgently because it is critical to the continuance of the group. In other words, Kennedy's inquiries and his efforts to get to the bottom of the UFOs, psychological warfare, MJ-12, threatened MJ-12. And it's right there. Now, the 8th directive, there are 8 directives in that document. It's a draft document, so we don't know what the final document looked like, but that was probably burned. And the reason we have this leaked document is because it was a draft document. So it was a draft document, so the way in which it worked at the time was that draft classified documents, there was kind of a little more ambiguity as to how they were treated as opposed to final documents. So anyway, this is a draft document, but we think it's pretty close, if not verbatim, was what was finally agreed to. So the directive, which is called Operation Environment, it says at the bottom there, directive regarding project environment. It says, when conditions become non-conducive for growth in our environment and Washington cannot be influenced any further, the weather is lacking any precipitation. It should be wet. Well, this is clearly code for something, and it was written this way so that way any secretary who was typing this up wouldn't get shocked over what it was saying. But it's very clear to a seasoned intelligence operator, that this was an assassination directive. Dr. Wood explains very clearly that it should be wet refers to assassination, wet works. And the other phrases in there, when Washington cannot be influenced any further, that's basically saying when Kennedy or his administration aren't doing what MJ-12 tells them, then this assassination directive was there to be implemented. So it's really an authorization for anyone issued this directive to remove any member of Kennedy's administration, including himself, if their activities threaten MJ-12 conditions or MJ-12's existence. When conditions become non-conducive for growth, well, obviously that's referring to MJ-12. If Kennedy's threatening to abolish MJ-12, like he abolished the Operations Coordinating Board in 1961, MJ-12 looked at that and probably thought, well, is he going to come after us next? Don't tell him anything about us. Keep it secret, because if you tell him too much, he'll abolish us and put his own people in place. So that was probably the attitude at the time. So this is a smoking gun document, and I'll come back to that later. The authenticity of the Byrne memo, according to Dr. Wood and his son Ryan, the Byrne document is an original carbon with an eagle watermark, characteristic of government work, but so far forensic laboratories have been unable to trace it. Although no date is given, its content directly suggests the month of September. The year is estimated to be in the early 1960s, and it is still under investigation. So they assign it the highest level of authenticity. So when you go through the Majestic Documents website, there's an authenticity ranking. They have low, medium, medium to high, and then the highest. A lot of the documents are medium to high. There's a few that are medium, very few that are that are considered at the highest level. So this is one of those documents that are considered at the highest level of authentication. That means that forensic analysis has been used and shown that that Byrne memo document is real, it's genuine. So this was an assassination, a cryptic assassination directive that was put together in the early 1960s, and I time it to roughly September 1961, just before Dulles left his position as CIA director. So finally we get to the reply. This was Kennedy had issued his document, his memorandum in June, and this is Dulles's reply. It came in November. So this reply came after the 8 directives that Dulles had drafted and had approved by the executive committee of the Majestic-12 Group. That was 7 people altogether, including Dulles. And so Dulles replies to Kennedy's request on November 5. So this is kind of like, Dulles dropping the mic. So he's dropping the mic on Kennedy, saying, "Okay, I'm resigning now. So here we go. This is what I'm saying to your request to get to the bottom of Majestic-12 psychological operations." So Dulles November 5 response gives an overview of MJ-12 psychological operations. He said that while it was possible some UFO cases are of non-terrestrial origin, these did not constitute a physical threat to national defense. So if you think back, when I was talking about that June memorandum from Kennedy to Dulles, he didn't talk about UFOs. He talked about psychological operations as they relate to Majestic-12 operations. But Dulles's response brings up the UFO issue, which confirms that UFOs were dealt with under the rubric of Cold War psychological operations. Very important thing to keep in mind. And Dulles concludes, "For reasons of security, I cannot divulge pertinent data on some of the more sensitive aspects of MJ-12 activities." So basically Dulles was giving Kennedy the finger. I'm on my way out. You got me to resign. I'm not telling you a damn thing. And that was it. So Kennedy didn't learn anything from Dulles about it. So Dulles's letter was giving Kennedy only minimal information and effectively telling him that he didn't have need to know concerning MJ-12 activities. So it was quite clear now that Dulles didn't want to brief Kennedy about MJ-12 activities because he didn't want Kennedy to get enough information to abolish MJ-12. Just as Kennedy abolished the Operation Coordinating Board in 1961, he didn't want Kennedy to do that. Kennedy was a threat. If he knew too much, he could abolish MJ-12. And that's important context for understanding what happened later. So Dulles's response strongly implied that the MJ-12 draft memorandum, including the cryptic assassination directive, had been approved. No way to tell what revisions, if any, were made to the draft. So that was really the important thing that we need to keep in mind, is that we don't know exactly what revisions, if any, were made to that draft, but we know the draft did refer to the Kennedy making all of these unwanted requests for learning about MJ-12 operations, wanted to learn about UFOs, and that the 8th directive was an assassination directive in case Kennedy or any member of his staff couldn't be influenced in any way, that MJ-12 was being threatened directly, and that then it referred to it must be wet. That was the authorization that such an official, even if it involved Kennedy himself, needed to be assassinated. Okay, so that gives us, so this really ends the first phase of Kennedy's efforts, because once Dulles resigned, that was it. Dulles's replacement as Director of Central Intelligence, John McCone, he wasn't briefed on Majestic-12 operations. I think what happened was that even though Dulles resigned as Director of Central Intelligence, he stayed on in that position of Majestic-1 for some time, and McCone came in and wasn't briefed. And so that saved McCone the headache that would come from him being briefed and then having to tell Kennedy, look, I don't know anything about this.
You have been listening to Exopolitics today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.